Hey everyone, welcome to the third episode of Aquarium for Dummies. I'm your host Torsten, and today we are going to speak all about Hardscape. As usual, we want to keep things as simple as possible in this series, and I'm going to share with you my thoughts and my experiences wherever I actually can. With Hardscape, unfortunately, there aren't that many things to talk about, but we are going to cover the two main types of Hardscape, which is wood. And with wood, we are going to cover the two main types, which is hard and softwood, and what are the differences between them. Then we are going to cover stones as well, and do stones actually change your water chemistry? And if so, is it good or is it actually bad? And then lastly, we are going to cover all of the other different types of materials and elements that we can actually use as Hardscape. So, in the first episode, we covered how to choose your first tank and what tank size is actually the best for beginners. In the second episode, we went through all the different types of materials that we can actually use in our substrate and how to build up a proper substrate layer. Then obviously the next step is to set up our hardscape. As I mentioned in the intro, there are two main types of hardscape, but we are going to touch on wood first. There are a ton of different types of woods out there, but they all fall under two categories, which is hard and softwood. Though only one of those categories we can actually use safely in our aquarium, which is hardwood. But why can't we use softwood safely in our aquarium? Every wood grain based plant out there, and yes, I use that term very loosely, produces and stores three things, which is resin, sap and sugars. We are going to cover resin and sap first, and we'll get to the sugars a little bit later. Any sort of freshly dug up roots or freshly cut down tree contains resin and sap. These two things are actually quite toxic to our animals, but how do they actually end up in our aquarium environment? Once we actually add the wood into the water of our aquarium, the resin is going to slowly but surely leach out into our water column, and that is going to have a quite bad effect on our fish. You've most probably noticed though that all of the wood that is used actually in a hardscape setup is actually completely dry, and that is actually for a reason. We can't add freshly dug up roots or freshly cut down trees directly into our tank, especially since the concentration of resin and sap in the wood is at an extremely high level. In order to reduce the levels of resin and sap, we need to actually cure the wood. The primary way to actually cure wood is through actually just letting it dry out naturally. As the wood dries out, all of the moisture is drawn out of the wood, which also draws out quite a bit of resin and sap. Yet, unfortunately, the curing process doesn't get rid of all of the resin and sap, and especially when it comes to softwood, the resin and sap is still at a very high level, unfortunately. This is primarily due to the grain structure of softwood. The grain structure of softwood is very, very loosely packed together, which means that there is quite a lot of open space for resin and sap to actually accumulate in. Then when we add the softwood back into our tank and actually submerge it underwater, it's very rapidly going to waterlog itself, and all of that resin and sap again is going to leach out into your tank. This process unfortunately goes on for quite a long time, especially since softwood contains so much resin and sap. But this is only one of the problems with softwood, and that brings us back to the grain structure of the wood. Once softwood actually dries out, the grain structure of the softwood completely pulls apart, opens up quite a few spaces throughout the wood, and actually makes it quite porous. Once the softwood becomes waterlogged again, the whole grain structure of the wood is just basically going to fall apart slowly but surely, and the softwood is just slowly but surely going to deteriorate in your tank. This is going to lead to another set of problems, especially since the wood is actually going to quite rapidly break down, which is going to release even more resin and sap into your water column. Plus, all of that broken down wood is going to release a lot of nutrients, especially through decomposition as well. And then you're going to end up with quite a lot of nutrient fluctuation throughout your tank. Now, all of this fluctuation of nutrients is going to open up the door to cyanobacteria and to algae outbreaks, unfortunately. And as I mentioned, your hardscape is just slowly but surely just going to disappear over time in front of your eyes. And these problems we don't have with hardwood. Though, as I mentioned, every wood contains resin and sap, and that also goes for hardwood. But the grain structure of hardwood is so tightly compacted together that there isn't really that much space for resin or sap in the first place. Then once we actually start the curing process on hardwood, the grain structure of the wood is actually going to just bound itself even more tightly together. The bit of resin and sap that is in the hardwood is going to get even more reduced through this entire curing process. Then once we actually take the hardwood and submerge it underwater and it waterlogs itself, the bit of resin and sap that is actually in the wood is going to leach out into your water, but it's going to dissipate out of the wood quite rapidly. The grain structure of hardwood is also hardly going to be affected once the wood is actually completely waterlogged, which means that the hardwood is going to keep its form, its rigidity, and its hardness underwater, which means that you can actually enjoy your hardscape for many, many, many years. Just to give you a few examples of softwood, that would be pine wood, cedar wood, or fir wood. A few examples of hardwood would be driftwood, manzanita wood, or spider wood, for instance. But as mentioned, there are a ton of different types of wood out there to choose from to actually add into your aquarium. Though before we end the topic on wood, I do want to say, don't just go out into your forest and just pick up any sort of wood and think that it is safe in your aquarium. Unless you are 100% sure that it is safe to use in your aquarium, rather leave it in the forest and just go get yourself some hardscape at your local aquatic store. Future me here, I actually completely forgot to speak about the sugars in the wood. As I mentioned in the very beginning, wood contains three things, and that was resin, sap, and obviously sugar. Now, the sugar in the wood actually has no profound effect on our aquarium or any effect on our water chemistry. Though in the very beginning, when we actually add the wood to our tank and it actually waterlogs itself, most of the sugars in the wood are going to dissolve and they're going to be released into the water column. Sugar is actually an excellent food source for bacteria, and one of two things is going to happen in your tank, and maybe even both together. The first thing that you might notice after a few hours after you add it in your wood is that your water is going to turn very milky. This is a bacterial bloom, and they are just feeding on all of the dissolved sugars in the water column. Again, you don't need to be that concerned about that bacterial bloom. It's not going to affect your plants or your fish, and it's not going to have a real effect on your water chemistry. All of the bacteria in the water is going to use up quite a bit of oxygen, so CO2 levels are going to rise quite a little bit, though it is not that dramatic, and it's also not going to have an effect on your fish. The plants are actually going to love this, so no real concern with that bacterial bloom. You can get rid of it just by doing a few water changes, and it's also going to disperse over time. As the sugars are being used up, the bacteria are also going to die off. Your water is also going to get clearer in the end. Then the second thing that is going to happen, that on the wood you will notice a milky white thick slime is going to slowly but surely build up. Again, this is also a bacterial bloom, plus it is also a fungus that is actually also just feeding on all of the sugars that is still inside of the wood. Just like the bacterial bloom in the water, you don't need to be concerned about that thick layer on your wood. It is not going to harm your fish, it's also not going to harm your plants, and actually some animals really actually love to eat it. Shrimps, snails, bristlenose catfish, or plecos, they will gladly eat that white slime on your wood. It's an excellent food source, especially since it's rich in protein and also rich in sugars. Again, this is going to dissipate over time. You can get rid of it just by brushing it off with a toothbrush and doing a water change as well. And as the sugars are being used up in the wood and as they dissolve into the water column, slowly but surely that white slime is going to dissipate. So also you don't need to be that concerned about that either. But I would say that covers it for wood, and the next main material that we use in our tanks are obviously rocks. Now again, just like wood, there are a ton of different types of rocks that we can actually use in our hardscape, in our tanks. But I'm pretty sure that you have most probably heard that rocks do have an effect on your water chemistry. And yes, this is true except for just a few types of rocks. There are only a handful of rocks that are hardly going to have an effect on your water chemistry, or actually going to have no effect on your water chemistry. Lava rock would be one of those rocks that actually have no effect on your water chemistry. If you want to keep some sensitive animals that don't like any sort of fluctuations in the water chemistry, lava rock is definitely the way to go with that. Otherwise, the other type of rocks that have a minimal effect on your water chemistry would be dragonstone or slate, for instance. Though unfortunately, a lot of other rocks are going to have an effect on your water chemistry. Rocks like limestone, marble, coral rock, sandstone, or rhinostone, they are going to have an effect on your water chemistry by raising the pH and actually also raising the hardness of the water slowly but surely over time. All of these rocks have calcium carbonate in them. This slowly but surely dissolves into the water column, and the calcium carbonate is the one that is going to raise your pH and also raise the hardness of your water. But even though rocks slightly change your water chemistry over time, it is hardly going to have a harmful effect actually on your plants and your fish. Now you can always keep the balance in your tank just by doing a weekly water change. But if you do have stones that raise the hardness and the pH inside of your tank, and your tap water is also pretty hard, then you can also just add in a water conditioner every once a week, which will also just keep everything nicely balanced. Now, there is quite a cool little way to actually test if your stones contain calcium carbonate, and that actually involves with some vinegar. You just take your stones outside, add a few drops of vinegar onto your stones, and you just observe and see if there's any sort of fizzing coming from the vinegar that is on the rocks. If there is fizzing coming from the vinegar on the rock, then that means that there is calcium carbonate inside of the rock. Though I have tried out this method on a few different types of rocks, and quite honestly, I didn't really get a reaction on any of them. And two of the rocks that I did test it on that I knew that there was calcium carbonate inside was limestone and cerulean stone. But if you do want to know more about a specific rock or just more about rocks in general, I am going to leave a link down in the description below to quite a cool website called the Guppy Garden. They explain all the different types of rocks and what they do to your water chemistry. They also keep it fairly simple, so definitely go check that out if you want to know a little bit more. The main thing though that we do need to understand with rocks is that we don't need to be that extremely concerned if rocks are going to have an extreme profound effect on our water chemistry. Now, I will always say do your research before you actually buy something, but if you do want to use a certain type of rock in your scape, definitely go for it, but just do a little bit of research on the rock at least so that you actually know what you're getting yourself into. But I would say that is it for rocks. Let's actually start looking at what other different materials or other different elements we can actually use in our hardscape. The first element that I would put onto this list would be snail shells. Especially for shell dwellers, snail shells are their home. This is where they also lay their eggs, and this is also where their young are going to be raised. Then the next thing on the list would be bone or coral fragments. Though I would be quite careful when you want to use bone or corals in your freshwater tank. Bone and coral are going to release a lot of calcium carbonate into your water, which is going to raise your pH and harden your water over time. Then next on the list, we come to the good old ship, the good old plane, or any sort of sunken vehicle that we can use as a decorational item inside of our tank. These decorational items are nowadays made out of poured resin, and if you are pretty creative, you can actually come up with some really cool scapes, especially if you add these decorational items with traditional hardscape like wood and stone. I've actually seen quite a few pics revolve around the internet at the moment of people actually being very creative using these type of decorations inside of the tank, and I find them extremely cool. However, there is also the cringy part of the resin poured decorational items like SpongeBob's pineapple house or Squidward's house. Then there's also the good old treasure chest or the scuba diver that bubble away inside of our tank. But who knows, if you are very creative, you could maybe also come up with some really cool scapes using those decorational items. One thing to take note of though, if you do want to use any of these sort of resin poured decorational items, do make sure that it is of good quality. Don't go and buy any sort of cheap ones off the internet. You will never know exactly what resin was actually used, if it is aquarium safe, and especially also if the paint is aquarium safe. But I would say let's get to the next one, and that would be fired clay or actually porcelain pots. I've actually seen quite a few tanks where people actually use clay pots and porcelain pots between their wood and stone hardscape, especially in cichlid tanks is actually quite cool. But the main thing to take away from clay pots and porcelain is that these are not going to have any effect on your water chemistry, which is actually pretty cool. Then we come to the last element that is on my list, and that is plastics. 3D printing and plastic molded parts have come an extremely long way, and if you are extremely creative and you have a 3D printer, then you can actually create anything that you can sort of actually even dream of. If you do want to 3D print anything and actually use it in your aquarium, do make sure that you actually use the right filament and that it is actually aquarium safe. PLA and PETG filament, they are completely water safe, but if you do want to actually paint these and weather these, also just make sure that you use aquarium safe paints. But I would say that actually wraps up the list of all of the other materials or items that you could actually use as hardscape as well. If you did enjoy the video, leave a like down below and let me know down in the comments what hardscape you have used in your tank or what hardscape you are planning to use in your tank. And if there is anything that I missed or you do have a question, well, let me know down in the comments below. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to not miss out on future episodes of Aquarium for Dummies. In the next episode, we are going to cover plants, which is going to be quite a long episode, I believe. But I would say let's keep the aquarium hobby simple, let's keep it fun, and as usual, I would say I'll catch you in the next one.